the theme of today, the life and times of Constance Couronne, the untold history, where we will feature the youngest child slave ever to be transported to Australia, Constance Couronne, a Mauritian slave child who was convicted of a crime, sentenced to life imprisonment, and transported to New South Wales at the age of 9, along with her cousin, Elizabeth Bellop, at the age of 12. We'll have among us today Nicolas Couronne, who is behind today's event. He's the Dis-Moi principal researcher who has been working with Gloria Provost, who is educator and a human rights advocate from Australia. Together, they have delved into the life of Constance Couronne and would like to raise awareness of this historical event still unknown in Mauritius. Also to be noted, Gloria Provost is a direct descendant of Constance Couronne, and today she will present the historic findings of the life of Constance Couronne, child slave, convict, wife, and mother to 11 children. Today, to introduce the theme of the slave trade, we'll have also, via Zoom, Professor Bening Mazimba. Bening Mazimba from Mozambique is associate professor at the Universidad Eduardo Mondlane, and she specialized in issues of women, gender, slave trade, and slavery within the context of pre-colonial Mozambique. We'll also have with us via Zoom, very famous Professor Claire Anderson. Professor Anderson is professor of history at the University of Leicester. Her research interests lie in the history of empire, particularly in South Asia, the Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean. Her publications include Convicts in the Indian Ocean, the Indian Uprising of Subaltern Lives, and New Histories of the Andaman Islands. She is currently editor of a Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History. To start with, we will welcome Professor Bening Mazimba from Mozambique. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Honorable Minister of Arts and Culture, Excellency Chair and Director of the Nelson Mandela Centre, dear members of the Board of Nelson Mandela Centre, dear guests and participants, please allow me to say all the protocol observed. I'm very humbled and very honored to be part of such an honorable audience. I'm not sure I will have the right words to be part of such an honorable audience. Please allow me to address 2-3 points in the context of this celebration. My first point concerns abolition in this part of the world, which we say is the Western Indian Ocean complex, where I am here in Mozambique. And abolition, when the British abolition started early in the 19th century, around 1805, 1807, it was followed by a number of attempts here in our coast of Africa, particularly in countries like Tanzania, Zanzibar, Kenya, which are English-speaking. There were strong attempts to abolish slave trade together with the practices of slavery throughout the 19th century. In the only Portuguese-speaking country in this part of Africa, in East Africa, which is Mozambique, colonized by Portugal, The first attempts of abolition started in 1836, and then they called in 1842 the so-called fiction, which was really a fiction, and then later in the 1870s, and then only by the early 20th century, there was effective abolition. The result of all these attempts was some sort of transition from slavery, heavy boarded slavery systems and slave trade, with huge numbers which affected countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, many of them which are part of what we say again, the Western Indian Ocean complex. But the most important point is that all the treaties concerning abolition, they did not have immediate effect. What does it mean, immediate effect? It means that the abolition of 1836 did not end slavery. Abolition of later did not end slavery. Slavery and slave trade died out slowly, along with the non-sustainability of the system itself. And when the British patrol was doing patrol all over the Western Indian Ocean, starting from far away in Somalia, in Kenya, Zanzibar, Tanzania, Mozambique, up to down in South Africa, and of course, countries like Mauritius and Madagascar and others were also affected. Despite the fact that official abolition did not bring immediate effect, when we talk about connection between Mozambique and Mauritius, there was, until the early 20th century, a few what we call freed people, the liberated, and they came directly from Mozambican ports, not just one port, particularly the port of Mozambique Island, Inhambane, and other ports located in Mozambique. Those free people, liberated people, included a number of women which were registered in Mauritius. Going toward my very few words, the special theme of today is particularly important. Today, we are going to try to listen to some sort of testimony which will tell us a little bit or a lot in terms of what happened in the aftermath of slave trade and slavery abolition. And I'm saying this because here, from the records, from oral history, from a number of evidence, it is very difficult to trace the history after the slave trade abolition. What we have is writings like slavery by any other name, which means that this is a publication about what happened after the abolition of slave trade, which means that after the official abolition, there were still forms of slavery and slave trade. We call it indentured labor, forced labor, but the most important is that slavery still continued in many countries in many forms. And today, when we celebrate abolition, with the true testimony of descendants of those we could trace, I can only associate myself to the previous speakers and say a very, very warm and congratulations to the initiative taken by Nelson Mandela Centre, because we are trying very hard to trace the history after slave trade and slavery. And of course, from our end in Mozambique, those who are registered there in your records in Mauritius, we will try very hard to trace the history through the different boards, and of course the Nelson Mandela Centre and also the Intercontinental Slavery Museum are the extremely important world institution, so that we will continue to trace the history in the aftermath of slave trade abolition. Thank you for listening. Merci beaucoup. Prochaine fois, je vais parler en français au créole.
So we'll now invite Mr. Nicolas Couronne pour son témoignage. And this part of the program will be moderated by Mr. René Coco. Bravo.
Alors, encore une fois, bon après-midi à vous. Very good evening. We're very delighted to be here. Thank you very much for your kind words. Alors, thank you very much, Mr. Director and Mrs. Imba, who was the last speaker. We are linked today by technology. I would like to thank all the team, wonderful team, who's working today to enable this event. We can give them a very big round of applause. Thank you very much. So we are very moved to be here in front of you, in front of those whose stories are not told or untold, like Constance Couronne. Untold no more, because since Constance Couronne, pioneer in Australia, through her struggles and resilience, managed to emerge and have an impact. So I will not keep you waiting. Thanks to the two passionate speakers who will take the floor after me, Nicolas Couronne and Gloria Provest. Nicolas Couronne is a former employee of MK and Mauritius, now manager of a secondary school, and he will soon turn 60. That's right. And you're happily married to Sylviane, who is in the audience there, and your father to Pierre and Maria, who are here this evening. So Nicolas is a member of Dis-Moi, which co-hosts this event with the Centre Nelson Mandela. So Nicolas, tell us more about how you came across the story of Constance and how you managed to unveil unknown facts about her. You have a microphone there.
Alors, Rodin, je crois un des plus beaux cadeaux qui un esclave donne nous, c'est nous la langue créole. Et je crois qu'on explique Gloria un peu ce qu'il m'a pu dire en créole par rapport à cette histoire-là. Et il est important qu'il m'exprime moi, parce que je connais c'est aussi télévisé, pour que tout le monde soit capable de comprendre et connaître cette histoire. Une histoire très méconnue de cette fille de mon trésor, dans les années 1824. L'inné dans les années 1824, il s'appelle Constance Couronne. Et d'après les records qui m'ont gagné ici dans le Centre Nelson Mandela, m'ont venu fouiller depuis 2018, c'est un grand-père qui s'appelle Lindo Couronne, qui étonnamment, après ça peut apprendre moi un peu mieux l'histoire de mon pays, d'origine indienne, déjà dans les années 1824, elle est née le 18 juin. Sa maman est décrite comme une créole qui s'appelle Adèle, et il y a deux frères, un appelle Théophile, un appelle Belloni, et un petit sœur qui s'appelle Julie. Alors tout ça, mon gars, dans mon records, c'est en source, c'est pas mon grammaire qui me vient raconter moi ça, c'est dans une source qui m'a venu chercher dans le Centre Nelson Mandela. Alors, moi, je commence à découvrir cette histoire-là à travers une photo qu'un camarade qui n'a vu moi. Je trouve une femme créole, assise lointaise, avec un habit anglais, et qui, dans sa figure, je trouve une ressemblance avec mon tonton, mon frère, mon papa. Ça, c'est une première chose qui me choque moi. Deuxième chose qui me choque moi, les mots de son nom de famille, je trouve Couronne. Je suis intrigué. Et là, je trouve sur région que mon grand-père est resté dans le sud, côté Maïbou. Je me dis, ben, il n'y a pas de fumée sans feu. Allons fouiller pour voir un peu qu'est-ce que c'est que cette histoire-là. C'est une histoire un peu embarrassante, nous avons dit au départ. Et beaucoup de monde, si tu peux commencer à entendre cette histoire-là, et dire qu'il y a famille à cette là, il lève carpet, il pousse ça en bas carpet, il ferme, il dit, n'oubliez-les. Alors, cette histoire-là qui était, tu fais là quand il a 8 ans, et que sa cousine Elisabeth, il apprend à coûte contre Madame Morel. Et tout, tu peux aller, tu peux apprendre à coudre, jusqu'au jour que le 11 mai 1832, un problème levé contre Madame Morel, c'est qui est une tentative d'empoisonnement de Madame Morel. Et là, ban causé pour lever en ban servante, etc. Et pour dire qui ça détifie là, qui finit faire ça. Madame Morel, pas de mot, hein? Il pour faire docteur Cox fini, docteur Cox pour confirmer qu'il finit une tentative d'empoisonnement. Et la police pour venir. Et ça détifie là, Constance c'est dans 18 ans, moitié de l'attention, et Elisabeth c'est dans 12 ans. Je te poil fermé. Je te poil au remand pendant 1 an. Je te cap pour passer en cours en 1833. Et en 1833, enfin, mon gars, tout un renseignement qui juge, qui est non, etc. Enfin, ça, c'est un Australien qui me tire sa porte, qui me fait moi gagner l'information là. Et tout un papier qui est non. Je peux condamner. Et là, cette condamnation, pour étonnement, je peux condamner à vie. Non seulement je te condamner à vie, et je peux le condamner à la déportation. Ça, dans mon histoire, on fait l'histoire jusqu'à Chelsea, dans le Collège Royal Kirpip, jamais me titandé. Jamais me titandé qui nous tient dans un convict qui t'y envoyé en Australie. Alors là, on peut commencer à le fouiller. On peut le trouver qui, effectivement, c'est non pas un esclave, c'est non un condamné qui typé envoyé à New South Wales. Et là, ça détifie là, c'est qui peut arriver pour mettre de l'eau au bateau, 8 ans, comme on dit, non, il y arrive 9 ans, et pour envoyer dans la prison New South Wales.
Merci beaucoup, Nicolas. Donc, on va poursuivre maintenant avec Claire Anderson. Vous avez parlé d'elle, puisque grâce à la technologie, en Zoom, nous sommes en contact avec Claire et on va se rendre à Leicester. C'est là que se trouve Claire Anderson, qui est professeure d'histoire et qui est très familière avec l'histoire de Constance, mais pas seulement. Il y a aussi beaucoup d'autres cas qu'elle a étudiés, puisqu'elle a écrit aussi des livres, notamment sur les convicts et les subalterns. Today, we are commemorating the abolition of slave trade. Claire Anderson, thanks for joining us from Leicester. You've studied very much the fate of enslaved and convicts. What do you draw from the experience of Constance and the other convicts?
Thanks so much, and thank you for having me today. I'm so sorry that I'm not around and available to see you all, but I will be in Mauritius at the start of October, so I hope to catch up with you then. I mean, the story of Constance is really, truly amazing, and I take my hat off to Nicholas and his passion for this project and for making this story known on the island. And it's just such an honor to be invited to speak by such a wonderful and passionate historian on the island. Now, I first learned about Constance in 1993, so nearly 30 years ago. At that time, my professor at university, when I was a student, was doing work on black convicts who were sent to the Australian penal settlements from Britain. And this included actually for the very first fleet of convicts which arrived in the penal settlements of New South Wales in 1788. And Ian had done an amazing job in the years before the internet of trawling through records to pick out all of the convicts he could find who were not white Europeans. And he did incredible work looking at Britain, so the black convicts who were convicted in Britain. He looked at the Caribbean, so the black convicts transported from the Caribbean. He looked at the Cape of Good Hope and also the island of Mauritius. And I just wanted to show you, if I may, the fiche. This is the fiche that Ian had passed to me back in the mid-1990s. And this is his transcription of Constance's record. And from this, we can see some of the details that Nicholas has just outlined. So her age, her religion, RC, is Roman Catholic. She was single, clearly. She had no children. She was convicted of attempting to poison her mistress, as we now know. Now, at this time, I started my own PhD project, which was supposed to be on crime and punishment in Mauritius. But I discovered that there had been an Indian penal settlement on the island in the early 19th century, where convicts were sent from British India to Grand Rivière Northwest, which was the base for a public works gang in the aftermath of the abolition of the slave trade and emancipation in 1834. And this ended up being my PhD, which was later published as a book and which Stefan kindly just mentioned. But I always remained very interested in penal transportation out of Mauritius. So we have this very interesting scenario that Indian convicts are going to Mauritius, and then we have Mauritians going from Mauritius to Australia. And so I spent in the mid-1990s about 1 year in Mauritius working in your fabulous archives. And I was able to complement these with research in the National Archives in London, which also holds records. And you can see here in this slide that I've been able to piece together the numbers of Mauritians who were transported to Australia. What's really interesting is that the Mauritians were the largest cohort of black convicts or non-European convicts sent to Australia. So about 133 altogether during the period 1823 to 1845, as you can see here. And just to compare that with South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, we have 25, and from all of the Caribbean islands together, 186. So Mauritius has the largest cohort. So just going back to Constance. So as Nicholas mentioned, Constance was convicted with her older cousin, Elizabeth Velop, and the original papers in the archives in Coromandel include the original trial records, a couple of petitions that were written later from family members, and there's also a note from Jean Jeremy, the Procureur Général, to the Colonial Office, which is found in London. And I just wanted to give the audience a flavour of the records that we have. This is an extract from Constance's testimony in court in 1832. And please forgive any of my bad French transcriptions, but this just gives you a sense of what Elizabeth said. It's a very interesting record because it's so rare for us to hear the voices of enslaved people, particularly enslaved children or enslaved women. So this kind of reported speech is really, really fascinating. And these records are all in Coromandel. Now, what we know from a later document that was written by the legal services, by the Procureur Général to the Colonial Secretary in London, is that the two girls, Elizabeth and Constance, because they were under the age of 16, the court was able to modify the punishment. So if they had been adults, they would have received the death penalty, but because they were under the age of 16, the court had the right to change the sentence. And it was originally decided that they should go to one of Mauritius's dependencies, which at this time were either Diego Garcia or the Seychelles. There were also some debates about whether to send the girls to Robben Island, but it was decided as young girls that this would be inappropriate, probably because there were fears that they would be victims of sexual abuse, I suspect. So that's something about Elizabeth and Constance. Now, I just wanted to show you a couple of maps just to show you where Mauritius fits in this story. So we can see here marked Mauritius. So we have some convicts do go from Mauritius to Robben Island. We have others who go to New South Wales and to Van Diemen's Land, which is now known as Tasmania. And they're part of this web of convicts moving all around the British Empire. And as I mentioned earlier, Mauritius is really significant because it's the largest supplier to Australia from the non-Anglo world. So really massively important in this history. We can also see here how Mauritius fits in the British Asian story. So we have transportation from British India to Mauritius, as I mentioned earlier. And some of you will also be aware of some of the convicts who went to Mauritius from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, following the Kandyan rebellion. So again, we have Mauritius as this really significant supplier of convicts. Now, my current project and how I had the great good fortune to meet Nicholas is that I'm funded by the Leverham Trust in the UK to trace the descendants of some of these convicts who did not go to Australia from the Anglo world. So these were convicts of African descent, Creole descent, Asian descent, including indentured labourers actually for Mauritius, as well as people of mixed or blended heritage. And there are many, many descendants of Constance. I know you have an honoured guest today who is such a descendant with you. There are many, many descendants of Constance living in Australia today. But there are two others, and I would like to mention them briefly because it's my great hope that we can tell an even bigger story through the history of these amazing connections between Mauritius and Australia. So the first is the Victor family. So John Victor was sent to Tasmania in 1839 at the age of 18, so a young man, and he was later transferred from Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania to tropical Queensland, to the penal settlement of Moreton Bay, which today is in Brisbane. And the family, the Victor family, who we've been able to speak to, have produced a beautiful family history, but we don't yet have any connections between them and people in Mauritius today. The second family is the Delphin family, a very interesting family. So two men, John Delphine and Auguste Delphine, were sent to Australia, to Tasmania in the 1840s. Both of them were ex-apprentices. In other words, they had been formerly enslaved, then apprenticed, and then liberated. And again, they were transported for theft. Some of their family actually now lives in England. So they were migrated from Australia to England later. And a really incredible story actually is that two of John Delphine's descendants were said to have captured the last surviving Tasmanian tiger, now believed to be extinct. And one of them, Dan Delphine, was said to have made a tiger skin waistcoat, which he took great pride in wearing around the island. So it's my great hope that we can perhaps begin to trace some more of these ongoing present day implications of this history to forge a better understanding of this interconnected world that we live in. And I close just with a photograph of Constance which Nicholas already showed us, but it seems quite fitting at this event that we close with what we think is the only photograph of an enslaved person from Mauritius that survives in the world. So thank you very much for listening, everybody.
Alors, merci beaucoup, professeur Claire Anderson, en direct de Leicester, je le rappelle. Nous allons enchaîner avec Gloria Provest, qui nous vient d'Australie, qui est l'incarnation même de ce dont nous avons parlé. L'histoire va parler, continue à travers Gloria, et elle va nous lire un poème qui a été composé par Nicolas Couronne ici présent, et qui raconte justement peut-être ce qui a pu être les émotions, ce qu'ont pu être les émotions, on va dire, qui ont été vécues par Constance quand elle était sur ce bateau qu'il a emmené en exil en Australie. Donc, j'invite, sous vos applaudissements, Gloria Provest à venir lire le poème.
With the foot chains, Constance seems lost on the ocean. She sits down on the ship in silence, yet the noise in her head is so loud. No one knows how empty she feels inside, and things she'd like to know remain unanswered. The police left her on the brig Dart with Elizabeth, and they had no idea where they were going. Their parents were no longer around them. She watched the hours flying by. In the sea of sorrow she was drowning in, she said to herself, "I won't cry, nor will I let them see my tears." Was this young convict able to get through her pain? Yes, Constance was stronger than she thought. Time did make it easier, and sooner than she thought, the pain did fade away. And soon, as a strong lady and mother, she was right back up there, head and shoulders above the rest. Mauritius, I survived the dark and painful days and the emptiness I felt. But what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
She's gonna now tell us about the Australian part, how Constance Couronne managed to go through her struggles and how she was resilient. So Gloria, first of all, what did you felt when you read this poem and you went through the story of your ancestor?
Very emotional, still that way actually. Yes, when I read that and read some of the things that happened with Constance and Elizabeth being sent to Australia as child slaves, it's pretty emotional still, even after all these years. So I'll try not to get emotional, and I'll give you all a snapshot of Constance's life in Australia. And I just want to thank the guests before me and the speakers for their information, which was very interesting for me, because we don't seem to celebrate slavery in Australia. So even though we've had slaves come there, so I think we need to look into that to see what we can do to commemorate the abolition of slavery. So thanks Rodney. Just start off to introduce myself, and just want to thank Nicola for inviting me here today and for this commemoration that's being held. And I'm actually feeling a little bit like Constance must have felt being in a strange land. But this isn't a strange land, this is a beautiful island. But not being able to speak the language, I think must have been very difficult. And I didn't turn up in chains and I can go home, not like Constance and Elizabeth could, and the other convicts that were sent there. Just like to introduce myself and let you know how I'm related to Constance. She was my 3 times great-grandmother, and her first eldest son was my great-great-grandfather. And I'd just like to say a little bit, did have mixed feelings when I think about Constance. Very sad and that she was taken so far away from her beautiful island and her family and everything she knew to a land with foreigners that didn't speak her language. I'm very proud to be a direct descendant of the young Mauritian slave girl deported to Australia at the age of 9. And it is now proven she is to be the youngest convict ever to be sent there. As well as having Mauritian heritage, I'm a very proud Australian Aboriginal woman of the Wiradjuri, Walwan and Nyampa nations. I've been an educator and a trainer for just on 40 years, working to improve inequality and justice in the lives of Aboriginal children and adults through mainly policy development and programs. This is my second time in Mauritius, as I came here 21 years ago to try and find out any more information on Constance. And we went to the archives and we found the records that Claire was talking about, all in French. Luckily, I had a friend with me that could speak French and read French, but we couldn't actually find out more than what we already had, which had been translated into English in Australia with the records of the trial in Port Louis. Although Constance was not able to return to her homeland, she had a successful life in Australia and went on to become a mother of 11 children, all living to adulthood. She was highly respected in her community and is known as a pioneer, helping to settle the central western area with her husband and children. Oh, better do that. That's my family tree. So you can see that Constance and Robert Trudgett are up the top, and then George, her son, Frances, Constance's granddaughter, and Charles Riley is my grandfather, and Joyce Riley is my mother, and that's me on the bottom. This is a photo of Constance's granddaughter, Frances, my great-grandmother, Granny Riley, celebrating her 90th birthday with Elizabeth, one of her great-great-granddaughters. And that's the closest photo we can get to the one we have of Constance. We don't seem to have any of George. So in 1834, Constance and Elizabeth land in Sydney Cove to the New South Wales penal colony. Can you imagine how frightened these two young girls were, arriving in this unfamiliar place, not being able to speak any English and therefore not able to communicate with these strangers? The authorities weren't even sure what to do with the girls at first. However, after a couple of days, they were placed in the notorious female factory in Parramatta, and with a number of undesirable female convicts where life there wouldn't have been easy due to their age, skin colour, and having no English or Gaelic language in which to communicate with them. This is the Parramatta Female Factory. Just some photos that I took before I came. It's not actually being used at the moment. They're renovating it to start a museum in 3 years' time. They'll have a museum, so I'm sure Constance will be in one of the displays there. Fortunately, after 2 months in the female factory, Constance and Elizabeth were assigned to Colonel Wilson to be personal maids to his 3 daughters, who had only been in the colony for 18 months. They find themselves living in Colne House, a luxurious mansion overlooking the beautiful Sydney Harbour. Constance and Elizabeth quickly become the favourite servants to the girls and constant companions to them. The Wilson girls instruct them in the Anglican faith, taught them English and proper French and some letters of the alphabet. The Wilson girls had previously done their schooling in France. Constance and Elizabeth had many opportunities to accompany the Wilson girls to walk the streets of Sydney to see how those in high society lived. And they also attended various functions and garden parties that the Wilsons had been invited to. They were even allowed to visit Madame Dubost, who would write letters that the girls dictated in their own language to their family in Mauritius. There were a number of interventions that were actually unsuccessful. In August 1840, Colonel Wilson made every effort to secure a pardon for Constance and Elizabeth, singing their praises to the governor in the hope he might permit their restitution to their parents. This was not successful, however. He did manage to persuade the governor to award the girls a bounty for good conduct in assigned service, which he later claimed was the first time that such a gratuity was ever given to female convicts in the colony. A number of approaches to Mauritian authorities by Elizabeth's uncle, Nereus Vallop, and Colonel Wilson to have the girls pardoned due to their excellent character were denied. After 6 years in Sydney, Constance leaves for Bathurst, a 10-day trip west over the Blue Mountains with her mistress Marcia, the second eldest Wilson daughter, who was to marry William Finch. Elizabeth, now 18, remains in Sydney. She is now separated from Constance, the only family she has had for the past 7 years. And only 1 month after Constance leaves, she marries John Larriman, a Mauritian man. She remained in the Sydney area and had 6 children, of which at least 3 die in infancy. Elizabeth is widowed 20 years later. She has a 5-year-old son at the time. Not a lot is known of Elizabeth after she marries, and she dies sadly at the age of 53. Following Marcia's wedding in Bathurst, Constance moves with her and her new husband, William, further west to a settlement called New Brigham, where she meets Robert Trudgett, who is working for the Finch family. Robert, an ex-convict from Suffolk, England, who worked as a stockman for the Finch family on the New Brigham run. Robert and Constance were married the following year in the Holy Trinity Church, Bathurst, on the 3rd of March, 1841. Constance was only 16 years of age at the time, and there were a lot of paperwork and documents passed between the government officers and the Wilsons and the Finch to get approval for her to marry, not because she was 16 years of age, but because she was still a convict. After their marriage, Constance and Robert continued to work for the Finch family at the development of New Brigham, which is near Wellington in the central west area of New South Wales, an area which is growing rapidly. Constance has settled well into life in the bush and has developed an affinity with a couple of Aboriginal women also working for the Finch family. She has no trouble understanding their culture, and they work well together, especially when making butter and cheese. At least two of Constance's children, Robert and Emily, are born on New Brigham Run and christened together with the Finch children. One being George, I've already said that, and he's the eldest son, and who is my great-great-grandfather. That was where they lived on the homestead at New Brigham. The next photo is the New Brigham Inn, which is just being renovated today, and it's the only thing that's standing in New Brigham from those days. So everything else is gone, but that's just been heritage listed, so they're doing renovations on it. Constance is granted a pardon. For a convict transported for life, this was a reasonably short period for Constance to have had to wait. This was probably due to the influence of William Finch, as he was a magistrate and an officer of the territory. She was granted a ticket of leave in March 1845, followed by her conditional pardon in 1847. A ticket of leave allowed a convict to work for their own benefit and to acquire property on the condition that he or she lived within a prescribed area, attended a muster every few months, and went to church weekly. A conditional pardon was given to well-behaved convicts who had been transported for life. This allowed them freedom, but not allowed to leave the country or the colony. Robert and Constance purchased their own property in 1854 called Gumflat, near Newbrigan, and shortly thereafter moved there. Robert had become an experienced stockman after working for Finch and Warne and had purchased a few cattle of his own and now described himself as a grazier. They bred merino sheep, which were in high demand for their meat and fine wool. They are photos of Gumflat. While Constance was renowned for being the midwife around the local area, she also had excellent skills as an embroiderer and a needlewoman. Constance raises her 11 children to adulthood and works side by side with Robert in the development of their property, Gumflat. They went on to purchase many more properties, to breed sheep and fatten bullocks, which their adult sons helped to run. Constance was highly respected and renowned as an amazingly strong and resilient, hard-working woman who became a pioneer of Australia, and together with her husband and large family, helped to settle and expand the western area of New South Wales. We need to remember, though, at these times, this was in the 1800s, and during a period of harsh and unstable times, including conflict between Europeans and Aboriginal people who were being pushed off their land and pushed away from their food sources, and the waterholes were being ruined by the sheep and cattle that were brought in. Bushranges, floods and droughts were other things that they had to deal with, and Constance went through more than one flood and a few droughts, but they worked their hard again and came back, got themselves back up. Constance also wore a signet ring engraved with her initials CT, which she used as her signature when signing documents, as while the Wilson daughters instructed Constance and Elizabeth in the Anglican faith, English, proper French, and some letters of the alphabet. They didn't teach her to learn and write, to read and write. Constance was an avid smoker and never went anywhere without her clay pipe. She'd stick it in the top of her stocking, and that's where it stayed when she wasn't using it. Robert died on the 5th of May, 1871, at the age of 62. And Constance continues to work Gumflat with help from her family. Constance remained lifelong friends with the 3 Wilson girls, all now married to the 3 Finch brothers who live on properties close by. Constance sadly dies on the 18th of November, 1891, aged almost 70, surrounded by many of her loving children and grandchildren. She's buried with Robert in the Old Church of England section of the Orange Cemetery. And I'd just like to finish by saying once again how very proud I am of my 3 times great-grandmother Constance and her amazing strength to overcome many hardships, especially having to leave her family and her life in Mauritius at such a young age, and to be able to adapt to a completely new life in a foreign country and make a successful and fulfilling life with her large family in a strange and harsh environment. Constance has left a legacy of over 3,000 descendants, of which I am very proud to be one. Gumflat is still owned by some of the Trudgetts, and we have a Trudgett family tree on Facebook for descendants to link up and share stories. Many of the 3,000 descendants are still living in the western area of New South Wales, including me. I live in Bathurst, where Constance and Robert got married. Both Constance and Robert have a parish named after them. And the memory of Constance is kept alive by regular family gatherings and reunions to honour hers and Robert's life and Constance's amazing achievements, from the little Mauritian slave girl to a recognised and respected Australian pioneer. And there's just a few pics of some of her descendants. My granddaughter put that up. There are a few pics of some of my family there, and living in the area of Constance and Robert. And they're very proud of the little slave girl deported to Sydney. They know the story, and as a 9-year-old, and went on to being a highly respected woman in her community as a pioneering heroine. Constance has had much written about her life in a number of books in Australia, and we have brought along a couple here today that you'll see up the back. And these are some other my aunties, great aunties, and all descendants from Constance. My nieces and nephews, some of them, who have a very big family, like Constance. They're the Trudgetts at Parramatta Female Factory having a reunion. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me.
Merci. Thank you very much, Gloria Provost, for your presentation. C'est vrai que, à cause de la situation, Constance fait réussir à retourner Maurice. Et moi, c'est une revanche aujourd'hui qui se descendant direct. Une vina pour capable présenter justement ces histoires avec beaucoup d'émotion, encore une fois. Tenez un applaudissement pour Gloria Provost. Thank you. Je suis content. Invite le membre de l'assistance. Si je tiens peut-être une question, une réaction, une observation. Voilà, les questions et une question finalement. Voilà.
Bonsoir, je me présente. Mon nom c'est Kadres Ambougan et je suis dans le domaine de l'éducation. So I work in education as well. But I'm basically a geographer, but not a historian. So I thank you very much for this event. And I followed it very attentively, and I think it's a lesson. My two questions would be: first question is about when you say pioneer. In many big countries, continental countries, you had a pioneering front, like in Brazil, like in Australia, and as if a question would be the role of convicts, women in this case. Their role sur les fronts pionniers, like in America, like in South America. It's something which, you see what as if the role in pioneering, faire avancer le front dans la colonisation et le rôle apporté. My second point would be on the educational value. How far have we been able to take this narrative, this story, towards school children in Australia, for example. Thank you.
Alors, je crois que c'est la régie m'informe que Claude Anderson, comme si va peut-être répondre à ce propos, ou quelqu'un de l'assistance. En attendant.
I can offer a response.
Claire is still online.
Thank you for that question. Can I offer a response?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Thank you. So that's such an important question. And my view would be, having looked at the history of penal colonies and convicts across the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese empires, and in China and Japan, is that convicts are pioneers in exactly the way that you describe. They are expendable labor for building infrastructure, for turning jungles into productive plantations, and for building roads and networks of communication, lighthouses, dockyards, roads, bridges, etc. It might interest you to know that when Charles Darwin visited Mauritius, on his round the world tour in the 1820s, he specifically connected the development of Mauritius roads to the presence of convicts on the island. And the building of roads in the 1820s underpinned a 10-fold increase in sugar production because sugar could be taken from the interior to the ports. So, Monsieur, you are absolutely correct. Convicts have a very important role as pioneers in occupation and in development by foreign powers in new territories.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you very much. Do we have another question or comment? Nicholas doesn't want to leave you, Claire, and he's going to address you a question.
Claire, you know, history is not built in stones. When new elements are found, can we say that history can be revisited? Because when you go on the net, you will find that it's Mary Ward and John Hudson, who are the youngest convict of Australia at the age of 13. And Constance was in Australia at the age of 10. Isn't she the youngest convict of Australia?
Thank you. Yes, that is my understanding also. And Gloria had also mentioned that Constance and Elizabeth were the youngest convicts ever sent to Australia. And I completely agree with you that history can be rewritten and history changes, because we only know about history because of the research that we do. And that research is always progressing and it's never really completed. But yes, my understanding also is that they were the youngest convicts ever transported to the Australian colonies, either Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, or New South Wales.
I ask the audience to have a round of applause for you, Claire. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us.